The rain was coming down hard that morning, the kind of rain that makes the world look gray and tired. I sat by the window, sipping lukewarm coffee, when I noticed an envelope on my doorstep. It wasn't just any envelope. Cream-colored, thick, and heavy, with embossed letters on the top. Hartwell Morrison and Associates. A law firm. Something in me already knew this wasn't junk mail. I picked it up with shaky hands and held it against the light. My heart thudded, like it wanted out of my chest. Inside, a truth waited. One that would change everything. I slid my finger under the seal, broke it open, and unfolded the crisp paper. My eyes scanned the words, but it felt like my brain was lagging behind. "Dear Mrs. Melania," it began. By the time I finished reading, my coffee was cold, and my whole world had shifted. My aunt, Ivana, my father's sister, had passed away. A woman I barely knew. We weren't close. She lived in Boston, and we exchanged little more than Christmas cards and an occasional phone call. And yet, she had left me everything. $4.2 million. Property in Vermont. A summer home in Maine. Liquid assets I couldn't even begin to imagine. I had to sit down. The paper shook in my hands as the numbers burned into my mind. Millions. Me. The woman who had been clipping coupons last week at the grocery store, who'd learned how to stretch leftover vegetables into soup. The woman who had been patching sweaters instead of buying new ones. It was surreal, like a cruel joke from the universe. Because just 3 weeks earlier, I had been sitting in a very different room, under very different lights. The doctor's office. I can still hear the hum of the fluorescent bulbs, feel the cold of that chair pressing into my back, smell the sterile air that made everything seem sharper, harsher. Dr. Reeves, my physician for years, had looked at me with eyes so full of pity I almost knew the truth before he said a word. "Melania," he began gently, "it's staged for pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe 8, if treatment buys us time. 6 months. 8 if I was lucky." My world had already collapsed once that day. I walked out of that office in a daze, clutching pamphlets I never read, watching raindrops slide down the glass of my car window. Time suddenly wasn't a stretch of years. It was a countdown. And now here I was again, staring at another letter, this one promising riches beyond anything I'd ever dreamed of. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. The irony was too sharp to ignore. When I was counting pennies, I had years ahead of me. And now, with millions in my name, I had months. Life, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. That evening, I called my lawyer, Ryan, just to confirm I hadn't misread it. He was as stunned as I was. "Melania," he said slowly, "this is substantial. You'll need to think about estate planning." His words echoed in my mind. Estate planning. Wills. Beneficiaries. And then he asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Have you told your children?" The truth was no. I hadn't. I hadn't even told them about the diagnosis. And in that silence, as I sat alone in my small living room, I felt something click inside me. A decision. I wanted to know who really loved me. Who would show up when there was nothing to inherit but memories. Who would still call, still visit, still hold my hand through the storm, without the lure of millions hanging in the air. So, I decided. I would tell them about the cancer. But not about the money. I would watch, I would listen, and I would see who truly cared for me in my final months. The envelope lay on the table like a secret. My secret. The rain tapped against the window, steady and relentless. And for the first time in my life, I realized I held the power. Not in the money, but in the silence. The test had just begun. The morning after the letter arrived, I sat in my favorite chair, staring at it as though it might change its words overnight. But it didn't. The money was still mine. The cancer was still real. I knew I had to make calls. Not about the money, no, that would stay locked inside me for now, but about the illness. My children needed to know. I picked up the phone and dialed my eldest first, Christopher. 38 years old, living in Seattle, a successful contractor, at least on paper. His phone went straight to voicemail. That was nothing new. I listened to the beep and said, "Chris, it's Mom. I have some news. Please call me back." My voice cracked, but I forced myself not to cry. I hung up and tried my daughter, Olivia. 35, marketing executive, always rushing, always distracted. She answered on the second ring. "Mom, can this wait? I'm in a meeting." "Olivia," I said, my hand trembling around the phone. "It can't wait. I just left the doctor last week. I have cancer. Advanced cancer. 6 months, maybe less." The clicking of her keyboard stopped. Silence filled the line for the first time in our conversation. "What?" she whispered. "Mom, are you God? I don't know what to say. I'll call you back. I can't right now." And then the line went dead. I sat there staring at the phone, hearing the echo of her voice like she had just shut a door in my face. Next was Mark, my youngest boy, 32, a software engineer in Denver. He picked up with his usual cheerful, distracted tone. "Hey, Mom. Everything okay?" I took a deep breath. "Not really, honey. The doctors, it's cancer. Late stage. There's not much they can do." This time, the silence felt heavier.
"Oh, Mom, I don't know what to say."
"That's a lot. Are you sure? What about treatment?" "They said it's too far gone," I answered softly. He swallowed hard. I'll call you tomorrow, okay? I just need to talk to Sandra first. Maybe we can rearrange some plans." "Okay, sweetheart," I said. But when the call ended, I knew. He was already pulling back. 3 calls. 3 children. 3 different versions of distance. And then there was Rachel. Rachel wasn't born mine. She came to us when she was 7 years old, after her parents, my husband's brother and his wife, were killed in a car accident. She was quiet, broken, and terrified back then. Over the years, she became my shadow. My girl. When I dialed her number, she picked up instantly. "Mama?" That's what she's always called me. Mama. "Rachel," I whispered. "I have some news. The doctors say," my voice failed me. "What is it?" she pressed, her tone sharp with fear. "I have cancer. Stage 4. They say maybe 6 months." I could hear her tears before I heard her voice.
No,
Mama. I'm coming.
I'm coming this weekend."
"I don't care what they say. You're not going through this alone." I clutched the phone like it was the only lifeline left. "Rachel, you don't have to." "I do," she interrupted firmly. "You're my mother. I'll be there." And true to her word, 3 days later she was at my door, hair damp from the October rain, arms full of groceries, eyes swollen from crying. She dropped everything and hugged me so tightly I thought she might never let go. "You've lost weight," she said, studying me. "When was the last time you ate a proper meal?" "I eat plenty," I lied. She gave me a look that said she didn't believe a word, then said about cooking. That night, as the soup simmered on the stove, she asked me about the doctors, the diagnosis, the details I hadn't even told myself out loud. She didn't hang up. She didn't make excuses. She didn't say she'd call tomorrow. She sat there, listening, crying with me, holding me steady when I wanted to collapse. The difference between obligation and love had never been clearer. Later, after she'd cleaned up the dishes and tucked a blanket around my shoulders, I watched her from the doorway. She moved around my kitchen with ease, like she'd been born there, like she belonged. And that's when I knew the silence about the money would stay. Because I wanted to see this truth, bare and undeniable. I wanted to see who showed up when there was no promise of riches, only the fading time of a dying mother. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the rain against the window, and made myself a vow. The inheritance stays secret.
For now.
The experiment had begun. Rachel stayed the whole weekend. She filled my small apartment with the smell of fresh soup, the sound of clattering pans, and the steady rhythm of her presence. When she left Sunday night, she promised she'd be back the following Friday. True to her word, she was. Her visits became a pattern. Friday night through Sunday evening. Every week. Groceries in her arms, determination in her step. She never complained about the drive from Sacramento. She never hinted at how much work she was leaving behind. She just showed up. And in between her visits? Silence. Christopher texted me once that week. Busy week. Thinking of you. Will call soon. He didn't call. Olivia sent an email instead of a call.
Short. Businesslike.
Hope you're okay, Mom. Work is crazy. I'll try to plan a trip soon. Mark, nothing. I stared at my silent phone most nights, the glow of the screen mocking me. When you are dying, you learn quickly who checks in because they love you and who only checks in when it's convenient. Rachel noticed, of course. One Friday night, while chopping vegetables, she asked, "Have the others called?" I shook my head. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't comment. That was Rachel's way. She never spoke ill of her siblings, even when the truth was obvious. That night after dinner, I sat at the kitchen table while Rachel cleared the plates. The envelope from the lawyer still sat on the shelf in the living room, untouched. My inheritance. $4.2 million. And not one of my children knew. I sipped my tea, staring at the envelope. The money felt heavy, like a secret that pulsed every time I thought about it. And every time my phone stayed quiet, that secret grew sharper. I realized something then. The money wasn't just wealth. It was power. Power to see who really cared about me without the promise of riches. Power to watch my family's true colors bleed through. That's when I made the experiment official. At least in my heart. I would tell no one. Not yet. Not until I had my answer. The weeks rolled by. Rachel came, rain or shine. She scrubbed the counters, filled the fridge, forced me to eat when I said I wasn't hungry. She took me for short walks around the block, her arms steady under mine. She even rearranged the furniture, so I wouldn't trip when I grew weaker. She was preparing me for the storm ahead. My other children? They floated on the edge of my life. Christopher called once, distracted, his voice filled more with talk of deadlines than concern for me. Olivia promised to visit soon, but her soon stretched into weeks. Mark sent one short text, "Hope you're okay, Mom." And then silence.
Every time I set the phone down, my chest ached.
But I didn't cry. Not anymore. Instead, I wrote it all down. Each call, each text, each visit, or absence of one. My little notebook became a record of proof. One evening, Rachel found me scribbling in it. "What are you writing, Mama?" she asked softly. "Memories," I lied. The truth was harsher. I wasn't writing memories. I was writing evidence. Evidence of who came when there was nothing to gain but the fading hours of a sick woman's life. The silence from my children hurt more than the illness ever could. But at the same time, it gave me clarity. Love, I was learning, has nothing to do with blood. Love is who shows up. And I was ready to watch. By November, my life had settled into two rhythms: the steady, dependable presence of Rachel and the echoing silence of my other children. Rachel came every Friday evening without fail. She carried bags of groceries, new books she thought I might like, and stories from her week. She laughed easily, even when her eyes still carried the weight of tears she didn't want me to see. Christopher, on the other hand, called once every 10 days or so. His conversations were filled with complaints about subcontractors, deadlines, and his failing marriage. He asked about my health in the same distracted tone someone uses when they ask about the weather. Olivia was worse. She sent long, polite texts that sounded like they had been copied from a sympathy card. "Thinking of you, Mom. Wishing you strength. Hope to see you soon." Soon never came. And Mark, my youngest, had disappeared completely. I thought I was used to the ache of their absence, but something inside me hardened with every quiet day. The notebook where I wrote down their calls and visits became thicker with silence. One night, as I flipped through its pages, my eyes landed on the envelope still tucked on the shelf. My inheritance. Untouched. Waiting. That's when the idea took root. If my illness wasn't enough to bring them to me, maybe the whisper of money would. The next morning, I called Christopher. He answered, breathless, clearly between job sites. Mom, I'm sorry. I was going to call you this weekend. How are you feeling? I'm managing, I said evenly. I've been thinking a lot about the future, about Christmas, about what happens to my things when I'm gone. The line went quiet. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. What kind of things? He asked carefully. Oh, just the house. Some jewelry. Family antiques. I don't want to leave anything unsettled. The truth? The house had been sold years ago to pay for Leo's cancer treatments. The jewelry was barely worth $50. But Christopher didn't know that. Suddenly, his tone changed. You know what, Mom? I should probably come visit next weekend. We can talk about it in person. Next weekend. After weeks of excuses, suddenly he had time. I hung up and stared at the phone, my chest tight with a strange mix of vindication and heartbreak. Later that day, I called Olivia. She picked up quickly this time, her voice softer, warmer than usual.
Mom.
How are you holding up? I let out a sigh. I'm trying, sweetheart. But the doctors say I need to start making some decisions. About my estate. There was a pause, followed by a rush of words. Of course, Mom. That's important. Family is what matters most. I'll see if I can rearrange my schedule and maybe fly out soon. Maybe even next weekend.
Just like that.
And Mark? He finally picked up after weeks of silence. His voice was unusually bright.
Mom.
I've been meaning to visit. Sandra and I were just talking about maybe planning a trip. We could combine it with seeing you. Combine it? As if seeing his dying mother was just a side errand to add to his weekend getaway. I ended the call and set the phone down slowly. My hands trembled, not from illness, but from clarity. They weren't coming for me. They were coming for what they thought I had. That Friday, when Rachel arrived, she noticed my mood before she even put her bags down. You look tired, she said gently. What happened? I told her about the calls. About how the moment I hinted at inheritance, my other children suddenly found room in their schedules. Her eyes darkened, though she kept her voice steady. So they're coming. Yes, I said. All of them. Next weekend. Rachel busied herself unpacking groceries, but I saw the tension in her shoulders. She didn't say what we both knew, that their sudden interest wasn't about love. That night, as she cooked, she finally asked, Are you going to tell them? About the real inheritance. I sat at the table, watching the steam rise from the pot. Not yet. I want to see what they do first. I want to see how far they'll go. She stirred the soup with sharp, deliberate motions. And if they disappoint you? I met her eyes. Then they'll learn what consequences look like. The rain tapped against the window. The envelope glowed faintly in the lamplight, like a silent witness. The stage was set. The following Saturday, my apartment felt different. Heavier. Like the walls themselves knew what was about to happen. Christopher was the first to arrive. He hugged me with one arm, already glancing around the living room as though he were taking inventory. His eyes lingered on the shelf, on the envelope I'd left there on purpose. Mom, you're looking good, he said with a too bright smile. I'd lost 15 pounds and could barely walk across the room without losing my breath. But apparently I looked good enough to live long enough to sign papers. An hour later, Olivia breezed in, wearing expensive perfume that filled the room too quickly. She hugged me tighter, but her words felt rehearsed. Mom, I've missed you so much. I should have come sooner. Sooner. The word landed like a stone in my stomach. By mid-afternoon, Mark and Sandra arrived with flowers and a box of chocolates. He kissed my cheek, But even in that moment, his eyes drifted to the side table, to the same envelope his brother had already noticed. We gathered around my small dining table, the four of us in a mockery of family dinners. The room buzzed with polite chatter, work updates, holiday plans, shallow compliments. But under it all, I could feel their eyes, circling the envelope, waiting for me to bring it up. I let them wait. Eventually, Olivia broke the silence. "Mom, what's that?" She nodded toward the envelope. I smiled faintly. "Just some paperwork from my lawyer. Nothing urgent." But I saw it in their faces, the hunger, the calculation. They leaned in a little closer, suddenly more engaged. As the evening went on, their stories grew more desperate. Christopher reminisced about childhood Christmas mornings, painting himself as the dutiful son who had always cared for me. Olivia laughed too loudly at her own memories, inserting herself into stories I barely recognized. Mark complimented the house, the furniture, anything he thought might matter in a will. I listened quietly, my tea cooling in my hands. These weren't my children. They were performers auditioning for the role of favorite heir. Finally, Mark leaned forward, his voice careful. "Mom, have you made arrangements? With everything going on, have you updated your will?" The question hung in the air like a trap. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me, wide with anticipation. I let the silence stretch, let the clock tick loudly in the kitchen, let them wonder. Then I stood up slowly and walked to my bedroom. When I returned, I carried the manila folder I had prepared days earlier. Inside were copies of my medical records, Rachel's adoption papers, and my notebook, my record of every call, every visit, every absence. I placed the folder on the table and sat down. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter. "Before we discuss wills," I said evenly, "I want to tell you about the last 8 weeks, about what it's been like since I got my diagnosis." Christopher shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we know this has been hard. Do you?" I cut him off. "Because here's what I remember." I opened the notebook and flipped through the pages. "Christopher, you took 5 days to call me back after I told you I was dying. Olivia, you hung up on me and disappeared for 3 days. Mark, you promised to call the next day, but I didn't hear from you for 2 weeks." Their faces flushed, but I didn't stop. "In those same weeks, Rachel has driven up every weekend. She's taken care of my appointments, my medications, my meals. She's been here. She's shown up, while you 3 have not." Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. Even Sandra stared at the table, embarrassed by the truth hanging in the air. Then I pulled out the inheritance papers. And 3 weeks after my diagnosis, I received this news. Aunt Ivana passed away. She left me her estate. $4.2 million, plus property in Vermont and Maine. The intake of breath was immediate. Christopher's eyes widened, Olivia's mouth opened. Mark leaned back, as if the number itself had pushed him. "Yes," I said calmly. $4.2 million. A fortune. And I chose not to tell you, because I wanted to see who loved me without it. Christopher spoke first, his voice sharp. "Mom, that's not fair. We do love you. We've just been overwhelmed." "Overwhelmed," I repeated, my tone like ice. "Rachel works full-time as a social worker. She carries 67 cases of children in crisis. And yet she shows up. Every single week." "What's your excuse?" Mark stammered. "She doesn't have kids of her own. She has more time. She has less money, less help, and more responsibility than any of you. And she still made the choice. That's the difference, choice." I leaned forward, my eyes steady on theirs. "You want to know what my will says? Rachel gets everything. Every penny. Every property. Every keepsake. You 3 will receive $1,000 each, enough to remind you that love cannot be bought with excuses." The silence that followed was thunderous. For the first time in years, I felt strong. The silence in my living room stretched so long I could hear the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. 3 faces, my children, my blood, stared at me as though I had just struck them. Christopher's jaw was tight, his fists clenching and unclenching against his knees. Olivia's eyes shimmered, but the tears looked more like frustration than grief. Mark simply shook his head, disbelief etched deep into his features. Sandra, poor Sandra, stared down at her folded hands, wishing she were anywhere but here. Finally, Christopher broke the silence. His voice was sharp, accusing.
This is insane, Mom.
Rachel has manipulated you. She's turned you against your own family. I sat taller in my chair. Don't you dare put this on her. Rachel hasn't asked for a thing. She's the only one who's been here without expecting anything in return. She hasn't had to turn me against you. You did that yourselves. Olivia leaned forward, her voice trembling. But we're your children. Your biological children. That has to mean something. I looked at her, really looked at her. It does. It means I carried you into this world. It means I fed you, clothed you, stayed up through nights of fevers and heartbreaks. But love isn't measured by blood, Olivia. It's measured by presence. And when I needed you most, you weren't here. Her tears finally spilled, but I recognized them. They weren't the tears of loss. They were the tears of someone watching her expectations slip away. Mark tried a different approach. His voice was softer, almost pleading. Mom, you don't understand. We all have families.
Jobs.
Responsibilities. We couldn't just drop everything. I cut him off. Rachel has a job. She carries 67 children in crisis on her caseload, Mark. She has responsibilities that would break most people. And still, she came. Not once. Every weekend. Don't tell me you couldn't. You chose not to. The room went heavy again. Their masks, the polite concern, the fabricated memories, the sudden love that bloomed only when money entered the picture, were slipping. And beneath them, I saw the truth. Disappointment, greed, entitlement. Christopher shoved back his chair, standing abruptly. This is emotional blackmail. No, I said quietly. My voice didn't need to rise. The truth carried its own weight. This is accountability. You've lived for years thinking love is automatic, that it's your right because I gave birth to you. But love isn't a right. It's a choice. And you didn't choose me. Sandra finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should go. But no one moved. They sat there, 3 grown adults, staring at me like strangers. And in that moment, something inside me broke, but not in the way they thought. The part of me that had begged for their calls, their visits, their affection, that part finally went silent. What replaced it wasn't bitterness. It wasn't rage. It was clarity. You still have time, I said softly. The doctors say I have a few months left. You could choose differently. You could visit because you want to know me, not because of what I leave behind. You could help me through what's coming, not for inheritance, but for love. The choice is yours. They looked at me, but none of them spoke. 20 minutes later, they filed out of my apartment, their goodbye hug stiff, their faces carefully composed. I stood at the window and watched as they gathered in the parking lot, whispering fiercely, their hands cutting through the air in angry gestures. Finally, they drove away, 3 cars disappearing into the dark. The room was quiet again. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel weak. I felt free. After the storm of that confrontation, my apartment felt strangely calm. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean like air after rain. I had said everything I needed to say, and now I could stop waiting for love that wasn't coming. The weeks that followed were softer. Not easier. My body was weakening, the cancer pressing harder every day but gentler. Because Rachel was here. True to her promise, she showed up every Friday evening with bags of groceries and a determination that filled the whole room. Sometimes she cooked while humming under her breath. Other times, she dragged me outside for a slow walk down the block, her arms strong around mine. When I was too tired to move, she read to me pages from books, little poems, sometimes just articles she thought would make me smile. I found myself laughing with her, even as my strength slipped away. Laughter had been missing for a long time. One night, while she chopped onions for soup, she asked, "Do you regret it, Mama?" Telling them everything. I looked at her steady hands moving so confidently on the cutting board. "No," I said. "It hurt, but it freed me. I don't have to pretend anymore. I can spend whatever time I have left with the person who truly loves me." She didn't answer, but she wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. Whether it was the onions or my words, I didn't ask. By December, I was weaker. The short walk stopped. Even sitting up for too long felt like a battle. Rachel adjusted without complaint. She brought her laptop and worked remotely from my kitchen table, answering calls in a calm, professional voice while keeping an eye on me. Sometimes I'd watch her as she spoke with families in crisis, guiding them with the same patience and compassion she gave me. The irony wasn't lost on me. My adopted daughter, who had once been a frightened little girl, was now a woman who carried others through their storms. One Saturday, she closed her laptop and said, "I'm taking a leave of absence. I talked to my supervisor. I want to be here full-time." "Rachel, you can't sacrifice your career for me," I protested weakly. She smiled, firm and gentle. "I'm not sacrificing anything. I'm choosing what matters. You matter." My throat closed with emotion. She had chosen me once, as a scared little girl who decided to hang every ornament on our Christmas tree as if she belonged. And now she was choosing me again. The days slipped into a rhythm. Mornings were for tea and quiet conversations. Afternoons for sorting through photo albums, telling stories, piecing together the history of a family that had been messy, imperfect, but real. Evenings for movies or music, her hand warm on mine as I drifted in and out of sleep. My other children called a few times, their voices strained, rehearsed. Christopher wanted me to reconsider. Olivia sent long texts filled with guilt and half-promises. Mark stayed mostly silent. I let them say what they wanted, but my heart was already elsewhere. One January morning, Rachel sat beside me with a box of old letters. "Tell me which ones you want to keep," she said softly. I smiled faintly. "All the ones that tell the truth." So we sorted through them together. Love letters from Leo, birthday cards scribbled by little hands, even old grocery lists tucked into recipe books. Every scrap felt like a piece of me, and Rachel treated them like treasures. As the weeks went on, my body shrank, my voice thinned, but my spirit grew lighter. The fear that had choked me in the beginning was gone, replaced by peace. One night, as Rachel tucked a blanket around me, I whispered, "Promise me something." "Anything," she said instantly. "Don't waste your life trying to fix them. Your siblings, they are who they are. You can't love them into being different." She nodded, tears streaking down her cheeks. "I promise." I reached for her hand and squeezed as tightly as my weakening fingers allowed. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for being exactly the daughter I needed." Her tears fell onto my hand, warm and steady, as if sealing the promise between us. The final weeks weren't filled with fear or despair. They were filled with love. Not perfect love, not traditional love, but chosen love. And chosen love was enough. By February, I knew my time was short. Every breath felt like it carried weight. My body had grown frail, my steps uncertain, my nights restless. But my heart, strangely, was lighter than it had ever been. Because the truth was out. The masks had fallen. And I no longer had to wonder. One morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The pale light through the curtains told me it was my last good day. Rachel must have sensed it too. She was sitting beside my bed, reading quietly, but her eyes lifted the second I stirred. "Good morning, beautiful girl," I whispered. She smiled, but her eyes brimmed with the truth. She knew. That day, I gave her my final gifts. I handed her the passwords to my accounts, the number for my lawyer, the location of the will. But more than those things, I gave her my blessing. "Promise me something," I whispered as the evening shadows stretched long across the room. "Anything, Mama. Don't carry guilt for them. Your brothers and sister. They are who they are. You can't spend your life trying to love them into being different. Promise me." Her tears fell fast and hot. "I promise." "And Rachel," I said, my voice trembling, "thank you for choosing me, for being the daughter I didn't know I needed, but the one I always prayed for." She bent low, holding my hand to her cheek. "I chose you then. I choose you now. And I'll choose you every day after." 3 days later, I slipped away quietly in my sleep. Rachel's hand was in mine. My last words, she told me later, were, "Thank you for loving me." The funeral was small, just as I had wished. Neighbors came. A few friends from the library where I'd worked for years. Some old church acquaintances. My biological children sat together in the front pew like guests at a distant relative's service. Their faces were carefully blank, their hands folded too neatly in their laps. Rachel stood at the podium, her voice steady even though her hands trembled. She spoke about love as a choice, not an obligation. About family as something you build, not something you assume. She spoke about me, not as a saint, not as a martyr, but as a stubborn, imperfect, human woman who tried to give more love than she ever asked for. She mentioned Christopher, Olivia, and Mark kindly but briefly. But when she spoke of herself, her voice grew firmer. "Mama taught me that love isn't about blood. It's about who shows up. And she showed up for me when I was a child with no one. I hope I showed up for her at the end." Not a dry eye remained in the room. After the service, my children approached Rachel. Their condolences were stiff, their questions sharper than their words. They asked about the estate, the inheritance, the will. Rachel handed each of them a sealed envelope. Inside was a check for $1,000 and a short note in my handwriting. "Love must be shown, not assumed." Their faces tightened as they read, but they said nothing. They left soon after, their footsteps echoing down the church hall. Rachel stayed. She used the inheritance not for herself, but to create something bigger, an organization for aging adults abandoned by their families. She poured her energy, her love, into making sure no one else would feel what I felt when my phone stayed silent, when my children stayed away. Every Sunday, she visits my grave. She brings flowers, sometimes fresh roses, sometimes wildflowers she picks along the roadside. She kneels, arranges them carefully, and talks to me like I'm still listening. And maybe I am. She tells me about her work, about the family she helps, about the man she married 2 years after I passed. His name is Mark, not like my son, but a kinderman. She tells me they're expecting their first child. If it's a girl, she says, they will name her Melania. In the end, I realized the money was never the point. The real inheritance wasn't measured in millions. It was measured in love chosen, in presents given, in promises kept. Blood had failed me, but chosen love had saved me. And that is the legacy I left behind.